Hello everyone, Alex here from WarrenOffKeys.com, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can create a voice channel that is going to count how many members are in your Discord or how many members are in a specific role. For example, here at the top we see Discord members. Currently the WarrenOffKeys Discord has 1,358, and we see that I added a comma in there. I'll show you how to do that. We also have 9 patrons, and so that will update automatically whenever someone becomes a patron role within the Discord. Now in that exact use case, that happens automatically through the Patreon bot. However, you might have a role claim channel like I do here. And so throughout this video, I'm going to show you how you can automatically have a Python role that will increase or decrease the number whenever someone clicks on the Python role right here, which will then give them the role within the Discord. And this will be set up so it will work on multiple servers and not just one. And real quick, before we start, if you do need help with anything, then feel free to ask in the WarrenOffKeys Discord. As you can see, we have a lot of people joining every day, and so once you join, you can scroll down and ask for help within the JavaScript channel right here. So with that said, let's get started. I'm going to be using the Commando framework. A link to a video on how to use that we found in the description. However, if you use a different command system, feel free to use that instead. So within the commands folder here, I'm going to go inside of MISC, and I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to name this role-size-channel.js. We first have to import commando. So constant commando with a capital C equals require. We're going to import it from discord.js-commando. And then we have to export a class. So module.exports. This is going to equal a class. We can call this role counter command. And this class will extend or inherit all the functionality. So we have to use extends of the commando.command class. So now within here, we can use a constructor, which will be a method that is ran whenever a new instance of this class is created. And this is going to be provided with a client argument here. And now within here, we have to call the constructor for our command class. And in order to call the constructor for a class that you're extending, you can call the super method. And this is going to take in 2 arguments. The first one will be the client, which we already have access to. The second one is going to be an object with some different configuration for this command. So the first thing is going to be the name, which is going to be role counter. Second thing will be the group, which will be MISC because that's the folder we're inside of, as you can see over here. Next is the member name, which will also be role counter. We could then have user permissions, which is going to be an array of permission nodes that the user who is running the command needs to have in order to actually run the command. For simplicity, I'm just going to add an administrator. Next, we have to add in a description. And here you can add in anything you want, but I'm going to say enables a channel to count the number of members in a role or a guild. And so this is going to be a description that people can see. After this, we have to create a run function. So we can say run equals async. This has to be an asynchronous function. Now within here, we're going to have a couple different arguments. These are things that Commando provides to us. The first thing is a message. The second thing is an args variable. Now, if you're new to Commando, the argument is always going to be one giant string. So if I were to say exclamation point role counter, some ID for a channel, some ID for a role, and then the example I gave previously was the Python role. So let's say I want the text to be Python : and then the functionality will then add in like a number afterwards, for example. But let's say that this is our command syntax right here. Everything that's highlighted here, the 2 numbers, and then the word Python : that's going to be one single string, just like this. We don't want that, however, we want this to be an array, so think of something like this instead. So instead of there being one giant string, we now have 3 different elements within an array. This means that we can access each individual one. Now, in order to do that within Commando, we have to do something called argtype within our options up here. We need to set this to multiple in all lowercase. This is going to make args an array, which is going to opt in for this syntax rather than a giant string like it is here. So at this stage, we can then pull all of these elements from the args and then verify that these are going to be valid channels, verify that channel is going to be a text channel, verify that the role actually exists, and then store everything to the database. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that the correct number of arguments actually exists. We need at least 3. The reason why I say at least 3 is because we can say something like Python count, : and this technically is fine. And then that means that there's now 4 arguments. So we need to make sure there's at least 1 word for the actual text, obviously 1 word for the role ID, and 1 word for the channel ID. So with that said, we need at least 3. So what I could do here is I can say if args.length, which will give me the length of the array or how many elements is in the array. If this is less than 3, we then want to complain to the user. Now, if you've followed my recent videos, you know that I like to get the actual command prefix for this exact guild, because when using the commando framework, each individual guild or each individual server can set its own prefix to avoid conflict with multiple bots. So with that said, we need to get the actual prefix that is being used in this guild. That means that we do need to gain access to the guild. So guild is a property of the message object. So I can say guild equals message. So we're going to destructure the guild property from the message object like this. Now at this stage, it's important to know that message and guild are not your typical message and guild objects you're going to see through Discord.js. Commando extends the functionality of these and adds in additional properties and methods that we can gain access to. One of those is going to be the actual command prefix. So I'm going to create a constant right below this called syntax, and I'm going to use template literals here, and this is going to be the correct syntax that you need to use in order to run this command. The reason why I'm making this a constant here is because we are going to use this multiple times throughout our error checking. So to start things off, we want to use the actual prefix. So we are going to insert in guild.command prefix. And this is a property that you can find in the documentation for the actual prefix attached to that specific guild. So at this point, we want to specify the name of the command. So we'll say roll counter, and we'll capitalize the C to make it a little bit easier to read. Then we need to specify a channel ID. We can actually say a voice channel ID to be very clear. And then we also need a role ID or all. Now I'm putting this in quotes because all is going to be the entire population of that Discord server. And so that's going to be something that is similar to what I have here, Discord members, and it shows the current number of Discord members that are in the server. So you can specify a role ID or the text all depending on what type of channel the server owner wants to configure using your bot. Now the last thing we need is the actual text. And now we have our syntax constant that we can use in our error messages, such as right here. At this stage, our if statement is going to know that we have less than 3 arguments, and so we need to complain to the user. So I could say message.reply. I'm going to insert in a template literal, and I'm just going to simply say correct syntax. We're then going to insert in syntax, and we want to make sure that we return here so we don't continue with our code execution. After that, we're going to want to gain access to our first element, or index 0. This is going to be our channel ID. So I could say const channel ID equals args.shift. So every array has this method here. .shift is going to remove the first element. In this case, it's going to be our channel ID, and it's going to return that into whatever variable we're assigning it to. So let's say that our array at this stage of the code is like this. And then after line 29, where we're using .shift, our array is going to remove this, and it's going to return it into channel ID. So now our args looks like this. So we can say args equals this, and then we can say channel ID equals this. Whoops, there we go. So it's going to remove index number 0, and it's going to insert inside of a variable such as channel ID right here. So now at that stage, we can now verify that this is going to be a proper channel and that this is a voice channel because we can only really do this with voice channels. So I can say constant channel equals guild.channels.cache.get. And here it expects a channel ID, so we can pass in channel ID. And then we can say if not channel, or channel.type is not exactly equal to voice. Now the reason why I know to check this, if we take a look at the documentation, so going to discord.js.org, and then we can go to documentation. Scrolling down, we can go to channel. And here, under properties, we see type. I can click on this, and it's going to be DM, text, voice, category, news, store, or unknown. So that means that we can check for a voice right here. And if it is anything other than that, which will typically be a text channel or something like that, then we're going to complain to the user because we only want to use the voice channels here so people can't click into the text channels and be confused. So now that we have this, we can now complain to the user because this if statement is saying that that channel doesn't exist or that the channel is not a voice channel, and so we can say message.reply. We can then insert in a template literal, and we can say you must provide a voice channel ID. We could then add in a colon, a new line, /n within a string will create a new line, and then we can insert in the correct syntax. We then have to make sure that we return so we don't continue code execution, and now we can verify that the role ID is going to be a valid role. our array is not going to contain this element, which means that index 0 is now this element, which is the role ID, as you can tell from the syntax. So I can now say const role ID equals args.shift, which again is going to remove it from the array and return it. So now we have access to it within the role ID constant, and it is no longer in our array. So at this stage, we want to gain access to the role. So const role equals guild.roles.cache.get. We can type in role ID, and then we can say if not role, we then want to complain to the user. But we also want to make sure that they didn't enter the text all. And so with that said, we do want the input from the user to be converted to lowercase. So we can use .to lowercase because we don't know if the user is going to enter all, or some weird combination like this, for example. And so we want to make sure that we are comparing it to an all lowercase string or all uppercase if you want to, but I'm going to choose all lowercase. So if not role, if that's the case, or if role is not exactly equal to all in all lowercase, because we are converting the user input to lowercase right here. So this is going to only run this if statement if the role doesn't exist within the server, or if the role is specified as all, which means that we want to count every single Discord member within that server or guild and not any specific role. So within here, we know that we've been provided an incorrect role ID. So I can now complain to the user message.reply, add in a template literal. We can say you must provide either a valid role ID or the word all for all guild members. We can then add in a colon, a new line, and we can insert in syntax. Again, we want to make sure that we return here. That way that we don't continue with our code execution. And afterwards, I'm going to take the remaining arguments and move them into their own variable. So constant text equals args.join space. So essentially what's going to happen, let's say that at this stage, our arguments array is now just Python count, for example. And so what we want to do is we want to convert this to a string that says Python count like this. That's what this is going to do. And it's going to move it inside of its own constant that has a meaningful name, which is text. And it's not just saying arguments, which could be anything. So whenever you're looking at this and whenever you're using the text variable, it makes it very clear what we're using here. So at this stage, we want to save this to a database. However, we don't actually have a schema set up for our Mongo database. So I'm going to save this file, and we're going to scroll down to our schemas folder right here, and I'm going to make a new file. This is going to be called role-size-schema.js. Within here, we have to first import mongoose. So const mongoose equals require mongoose, and then we have to create a new schema. So constant role size schema equals mongoose.schema with a capital S. We're going to pass in an object here, and then we have to specify the information that we want. Now, if you've been watching this series for a while, you know that I like to create one single constant for repeat types. So constant rec string for required string. This is going to be an object with a type of string, and required is true. So this is going to be a required string, hence the name. Now within this object down here, we're going to want to store the guild ID, the user ID, the role ID, and the text. So the guild ID will be a required string. The channel ID will be a required string. The role ID will be a required string. And then finally, the text will also be a required string. So these are the 4 pieces of information that we need in order to run this functionality. And so that's why we're saving all of these to the database. We now have to export a model of this schema. So we can do module.exports equals mongoose.model. We can pass in the first argument as the name of our collection. So role-size-channels. And the second argument is going to be our actual schema. So role-size schema, which we just created right here. We can now save this, and going back to our role-size channel and scrolling up to the top, we're wanting to actually import this. So I can say const role-size schema equals require at schemas / role-size-schema. Now the reason why I can use at schemas here to reference the schemas folder is because I'm using something called module aliases. I do have a video on this on my channel. However, if you don't want to use this, you can use relative paths. So we can go back and find our schemas folder, and then you can find the role size schema just like normal. However, because I do have module aliases installed, I'm going to opt into using that, so I only have to specify the folder name and not the relative path regarding this file and the actual folder location. So now we have this, we are now importing this, and scrolling down, we can now insert this into the database. And we're looking to use something called find one and update. Essentially, it is going to upsert something, which means to insert or update. If it doesn't exist, we're going to insert it into the database. If it does exist, we're going to update it. So I can say await. And because we're using await, this is why this function needs to be asynchronous right up here. So make sure you don't forget that. So await role size schema dot find one and update. This is going to take in 3 arguments that are all going to be objects. The first one is going to be the filter or the condition in order to find the documents we want to update, if any. So we need to specify a couple important pieces of information here. The first will be the guild ID, which has to be typed exactly the way you typed it within your schema. So I have a capital I and a lowercase d in all of my IDs. So with that said, I'm going to use the same thing here. We can then access the guild property, which we have destructured from message down here on line 20. So we can say guild ID is going to equal guild.id. Then we can insert in the channel ID. So channel ID, and we can just specify a comma here. Because we're using ES6, we don't have to repeat ourselves. So essentially this line is the same exact thing as this line. So these are going to be the keys or the filters in order to find the object. Now we're looking to copy these 2 lines and paste them inside of this middle object, which is going to be what the actual information should be updated to. So if this is something that exists, we are wanting to re-update all this information, so we need to add more things. But if this is something that doesn't exist, we are then going to insert this middle object here, which is why we have to specify these again. So some of the things we want to insert again is going to be the role ID and the text. And typing them like this, again, just like channel ID, is going to reference the variables values as well as have this be the name in the key value pair. So now within this last argument here, we're going to say upsert is true. And this is going to be what is going to make Mongoose insert this document if it doesn't exist, but update the document if it does exist based off of our first argument right here. So now after that, we can tell the user that it was set. So message.reply, we're going to just simply say voice channel counter set. So I can save this and I can go into Discord right here and I can go into my console and I can run my bot with node index.js. I can then run !role counter. And it's going to say the correct syntax right here is role counter, voice channel ID, role ID, or all, and then text. So I can say role counter, we want a voice channel ID. So I'm actually going to make one real quick. So I'm going to create a voice channel. This is going to be a private channel that only owners can see. And this will just be called test for now. Create the channel. We can right click and click on copy ID. We can paste it in right here. And then we need a role ID. So I'm going to go into my server settings, roles. I can then right click on Python and click on copy ID. And if you don't see the copy IDs at any time, that means you just have to enable developer mode within your Discord account. I can then paste it in here. So now we have the voice ID and the role ID. I then need to add in a space, and now this is going to be the text. So I can say Python : We don't have to add a space at the end because our bot is going to do that for us. So now we have to use this command right here. If I run it, we then see you must provide either a valid role ID or the word all for all guild members. That's because I made a mistake here. This should not be or, this should be and. We can then save and restart the bot. Now going back, I could try running the same command again. And it's going to say voice channel counter set. I can then go into MongoDB and we see right here that we have our object, we have our channel ID, our guild ID, our role ID, and our text. And so that is working so far. Now let's try a few different error messages. So let's say that instead of an actual voice channel, I use a text channel. So I can right click on tutorial, I can go to copy ID, I can paste it in here, make sure there's still a space. And then it's going to say you must provide a voice channel ID. Now if I go back to my original command and I insert in all instead of the actual role ID. Okay, so using all is still bugged. So going back, there's an easy way we can fix this. Essentially the role ID might be an actual word of all. So we can simplify this if statement. We can remove that. So this if statement is just saying if not role. And what we want to do here is wrap this entire thing inside of its own if statement saying if role ID is not exactly equal to all. So now we can save this and we can restart the bot. And then we can run the command that we just ran. So I'm going to edit this so I can easily copy it. And then I can paste it in right here. And it's going to say voice channel counter set. Now going back into Mongo, we noticed that previously we had our role ID for our Python role. If I click on find again, it is now going to only have that one document still, but our role ID is now all. The reason for that is because we used find one and update, and because the guild ID and the channel ID stay the same, it is just going to update that existing document using all of this data, most importantly the role ID and the text. And so that is why we see it updated there. So now that we have our schemas and our command set up, I'm going to go inside my features folder and inside of my nested features folder, and I'm going to make a new file. This will be called role-size-channel.js. And this is going to be something that is automatically imported within my project. And if you don't have my project set up, then you're going to have to manually import this and run it. So we can say module.exports. This is going to be a function with one parameter, which is a client. And so you have to make sure to pass in that client if you are calling it manually. Now the first thing we want to do here is we want to call a function that is going to fetch the information from the database. So we have to first make that function. So above here I can say const fetch channel data. And this is going to be an asynchronous function. And then right in here we can call this function, so fetch channel data. So now the goal of this function is to update an object, which we'll create here in a second, of a bunch of information regarding each individual role counter. So at the top here, we have to first create an object. So we're going to use let here. We're going to say channel data, and this is going to be an empty object. And there's going to be two different options for the way this object is set up. The first one is going to be a key value pair, where the key is going to be guild ID dash role ID, and then the value is going to be an array with channel ID and text. Now the next option is going to be different. So the key is going to be guild ID dash all, and then the value is going to be the same thing, channel ID and then text. So we have to keep this in mind that this is the structure, and if this is confusing at all, you'll see exactly how this works once I start actually interacting with this object and updating the information. But before that, we have to pull it from the database, and that means we have to import our schema. So I can say const role size schema equals require. Again, if you don't have module aliases, use relative paths. So you would be able to access your schemas folder and then role size schema. However, I do have module aliases, so I'm going to use those here. So next, within this function, we have to fetch everything from that collection. So I can say const results equals await. Because we're using await, make sure that your function is asynchronous. So await role size schema dot find. Pass in an empty object here, and this is going to return everything within the collection. We can then say channel data is going to be reset to an empty object, and then we can loop through all of the results. So for const result of results, and then within here, we're wanting to destructure all the properties that we find within this collection, or this document rather. So we're going to have our guild ID, our channel ID, our role ID, and our text. We want access to all of those, so we can destructure those from the result. So we have our guild ID, our channel ID, our role ID with a capital I, and our text. Now at this stage, we're wanting to create our own key, and that's going to be the key inside of the key value pair for the object of channel data. So I can say const key. It's going to be a template literal. We're going to insert in the guild ID with a dash and then the role ID. Now keep in mind that this is going to work for either structure here. The reason for that is that all is technically going to be the role ID in some cases, and so using the role ID right here is going to be perfectly fine. We can now store this to the channel data object. So channel data index of key equals an array where the first element is going to be channel ID with a capital I, and the second element will be text. So now to make sure that everything is working, I can console log channel data, and then I'm going to add another console log that will actually display the object, so channel data. Now we want to make sure that we update this every so often. So I'm going to use set timeout. We're just going to allow me to pass in two arguments. The first one is a function or a reference to an existing function such as fetch channel data. Keep in mind we do not have parentheses here. We're actually just referencing the name of the function. The second argument is going to be how long we're going to wait in milliseconds to actually call this. So I'm going to say 1000, which is how many milliseconds are in a second, times 60. So we're going to recall the fetch channel data every single minute. So now with that said, we can scroll down and we're wanting to export this function. So I can say module.exports.fetchChannelData equals fetchChannelData. The reason for that is that we're wanting to import it inside of our command and actually run or invoke this function as soon as someone runs the command. That way that it'll automatically update. So I'm going to save this, and going back to our command, we can scroll up and we can import it here. So I'm going to say const empty object equals require. This is within our features folder for the new file that we just created. So at features /role-size-channel. Again, if you don't have access to module aliases, you can use relative paths to get to features, role size channel. However, I do have access to that, so I'm going to be using module aliases, and we are wanting to import fetch channel data, spelled just like the function that is exported right here. So now scrolling down, after we've actually sent the message, we can then call fetch channel data, just like that. And that's going to automatically update our actual local storage here to make sure that whenever they're testing it within their bot, let's say that the server owner runs the command and they go to use a role claim or they manually assign a role or whatever they do, they're going to automatically see the result and they're not going to have to wait 60 seconds, which they won't be notified of. So that way they don't think something is broken. So scrolling down, we're now going to add more functionality within this function here. Our goal here is to listen for whenever someone joins or leaves the server, and also whenever someone's role is updated. With that said, we would then be able to update the actual channel that is relevant to that specific counter. So I'm first going to create a function within this function. This will be called update count, so const update count. This function is going to take in a guild. Whoops, I have two T's. We want to make sure we only have one T on count. So this is going to take in a guild and a role ID. Now this role ID might not exist in some cases, and so we'll have to look out for that. So first we're going to get the data based off of a key that we're going to create. So constant key, using a template literal, we're going to gain access to guild.id, and then we're also going to gain access to role ID or all. Now what's going to happen here is that if role ID doesn't exist, which means that if we only pass in one argument into this function, role ID will be undefined, then we're going to use all. There is an alternative to this. Either one will work. We could set a default value here, just like that. So I'm going to opt in for that, but I wanted to show you both options. So now we're going to try and gain access to the data based off of the channel data object, which we define at the top of our file up here. So I can say const data equals channel data index of key. Now we want to make sure that this is actually going to be something that exists. So if someone opted in for a role, let's say JavaScript within the Worn Off Keys Discord server, and I am not trying to listen for that, we don't actually want to do anything. So we can very easily see if this exists by just saying if data, because that's going to be undefined because it's not stored within channel data if it's going to be a role that we don't actually care about. So now at this stage, we're wanting to gain access to the channel ID and the text so we can destructure an array from data. The first element will be channel ID, the second element will be text. Now we have access to those, we want to gain access to the channel from the specific guild. So const channel equals guild.channels.cache.get. We can pass in the channel ID. And we want to use an if statement to make sure that this channel actually exists. This is important in case that channel was deleted. We're going to throw an exception or an error within our bot if we're trying to update a channel that doesn't exist. So otherwise we can use else. We can say console.log, template literal, missing channel for, and then we can add in double quotes, and we want to specify some information such as key, which is going to be the guild ID and the role ID, colon, and then we want an array. We'll enter in the channel ID, and then we'll also add in a second element to this array in the string, and that's going to add quotes, and we're going to then say text. So this is basically going to represent the object in the console for us as the developer. That way that we can actually look at that and see what's going on. But if the channel does exist, we then want to actually update that. So I'm going to say let count. I'm not going to assign anything yet, but we are using let so we can modify this in the future. And the goal here is to be able to have this count equal either the total number of members in the Discord server or the guild, same thing, or the total amount of members that are in the Discord server that have a particular role. So I can then see if role ID is going to be something that equals all. So if role ID is exactly equal to all, in this case, we want the count to equal how many members are in the Discord server. So we can say count equals guild.member count. And if you look here within the Worn Off Keys Discord server, I added in a comma for the 1,000 mark. And so you can do that as well by just simply adding in .to local string, spelled just like this. Now, otherwise, that means that we have access to an actual role ID. So we want to gain access to that. So const role equals guild.roles.cache.get role ID. And we want to make sure that this role actually exists. So if role, then otherwise we want to add a console log. So console.log missing role for role ID. Actually, we can use the same exact string right here. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it in here. So we have more information. But if the role does exist, we then want to see how many people have that role. So we can say count equals role.members.size. We want to make sure that we return right here. That way we don't continue on with an unknown count and an unknown role. So now at this stage, we now are guaranteed to have an actual role through either line 43 or line 39 right here. And we also have access to the channel, so we can say channel.setName. We're going to insert in a template literal. We're going to insert in the text with a space and then count. So if the text was Python : the text would then turn out to be space, and then whatever number it is, let's say 100 for example, this would then be the total name of the channel. So now the last thing we have to do within this is actually use the update count method depending on if a user joined or left the server or if someone's role actually updated. So I can click on this starting curly brace right here. I can scroll down, I can see where the ending curly brace is to make sure I'm in the right spot. Directly after this, we want to listen for a few different Discord events. So we can say client.on guild member add. This is going to give us a member object. And within here, we can call update count passing in member.guild. Now in this case, the role ID is going to be undefined because we're only passing in one argument. So scrolling up, role ID will be all, and that is what we want. Basically, when someone joins or leaves the Discord, we want to update any type of channel where the user has specified they want the total number of Discord members. So I can copy this, and I can paste it below, and we're now going to listen to guild member remove. And everything's the same here. We also want to listen for guild member update, which is going to be executed or fired whenever a user has a different role changed. There's a few other reasons when that event can fire, but for our use case, we only care about that one. So client.on guild member update. And this is going to take in two arguments instead of one. The first is the old member, which is the member before any of the changes, and the second is the new member, which is the member after the changes. So within here, we now want to see what role actually changed. So I'm going to first gain access to the roles for the old member and also gain access to the roles from the new member, and then we can loop through them and see what the difference is, and then try and update the channel for that specific role. So first, we're going to destructure. We're going to say roles. We're going to rename this into before roles. So roles is going to be a property of old member, but we are going to rename this to before roles. This is essentially the same exact thing as saying const before roles equals old member dot roles. These two lines are exactly identical. So I'm going to use this, and then I'm going to do something very similar. So const roles as after roles. This is going to equal new member. So now we have our before roles and our after roles for whatever the update was. Then I'm going to create a variable using let, because we're going to actually change this variable. This is going to be called changed role, and we're not going to assign any value here. We then want to loop through all of the roles. So for let role, it's important that we're using let here as well, of guild, which we don't have access to, but we'll gain access to in a second, dot roles dot cache. So we are going to loop through every single role in this guild, and we want to access this from either of these. I'm going to choose a new member, so we're going to simply destructure this from this property, and now we're going to loop through all of these. Now, for some reason, we're using a typical for loop with a cache. There's actually going to be an array returned where the first element is the ID, and the second element is the actual role. So with this said, we want to access index 1, so we can say role equals role index 1. This is important because otherwise you're going to be accessing an array and you're going to get problems. So now we are wanting to create two booleans. One is going to be was in before roles, so const was in before roles, and we'll set this to false for now. We will assign a more meaningful value here in a second. The second one is going to be is in after roles equals false. So before roles and after roles in these names is referencing these two variables that we have up here. So this boolean right here is going to represent if the current role that we're looping through within this for loop was going to be inside of the before roles variable defined on line 66. Now, right here is in after roles. This boolean is going to represent if the role that we're currently looping through is currently in the after roles. And so this is going to be useful because if these two values are different, that means that the remaining role that we're going to check for is either removed or added just now. So I can say if was in before roles is not exactly equal to is in after roles. Now, if this condition is true, that means that right here, we now have access to a role that is either removed or added just now. So we can say changed role equals role and then we can break from the for loop. Now we'll do some additional things after this for loop, but first we want meaningful values on these booleans because of course setting them both to false doesn't really do anything for us. Now it's important to know how to actually convert a object into a boolean if it exists or doesn't exist. So the syntax for this is not, and then before roles.cache.get role.id. Similar to here, we're going to say not after roles.cache.get role.id. So basically what's happening is we are going to be returned a role within the highlighted code right here. So just the highlighted code, ignore the two not symbols. This is going to return a role depending on the role ID. Now saying not is going to basically say, does this exist or not exist? The Boolean is going to be the opposite of that. And so if, for example, this role does exist, saying not beforehand means that this is now going to equal false. But if we put two not symbols, it's going to basically become the Boolean equivalent of if this role exists. So if this does exist, we are then going to say false, and then we are going to say true. And so if it doesn't exist, we are going to first say true, and then false, because there's two of them. So if it doesn't exist, the Boolean will become false. If it does exist, the Boolean will become true. This is kind of a confusing concept if you haven't seen it before, but this is basically going to make it so we can know which role was removed or changed within this event being fired. Now, after this entire for loop, we're now wanting to make sure that changed role exists. So basically, if there is something updated on the member that wasn't a role that we don't actually care about, so we can simply do that by saying if changed role. Now, because we're not assigning a value here, if this for loop didn't actually find any different roles, then the value is still going to be undefined. So this if statement is going to make it so we are going to make sure that this is a valid value within this variable. Therefore, that means that a role was changed. We can now call update count. We can pass in guild and then changed role.id. And so this is everything we should need to create a fully functional system. Let's go ahead and test it out by saving the file. We could then go into Discord. We can go into the console and I can start my bot. So now this test is still configured. If I go back over here and I click on find, we see Python, we see the role ID, the guild ID, and the channel ID. All of this is configured towards this test voice channel right here. So now if I go into role claim and I click on this icon, which will give me the Python role to confirm this, I don't have the Python role at the moment. I can click on this. If I click on my user, we then see Python. We also see Python is now 106. Now you might be confused why this number is different than this number. I'm assuming this is because there were some people who opted into the Python role and then left the Discord at some point since then. But if I click on this again, this now goes to 105. Now to confirm that this works for every single guild member, I can click on tutorial. I can find this right here. This is going to say all instead of an actual ID. I can paste it in here. And instead of saying Python, I'm going to say members : I can now run this. So now that someone has joined, we see that the members has updated, and so this was the same channel as before, but because we ran the command role counter with the channel ID and all, that means that this is now going to be updated with whatever text we specified, which is members : and then however many members there are. And again, the comma is added because we added to local string right here, and so if you don't want a comma, you can always remove this and just simply have guild.memberCount. Thanks for watching this Discord.js tutorial. If you want to learn more about Discord.js, consider clicking on the playlist you see on your screen now. If you need help, feel free to leave a comment or ask in the Worn Off Keys Discord, which can be found in the video description.